Hey Lifers, Dustin here, and today I want to take a look at a pretty controversial question, and that question is, was the BCS really that bad? Did they really get it wrong more often than they got it right? That's something I want to take a look at by breaking down pretty much each season real quick, not a big long thing, but each season pretty quickly, and figure out who I consider to be the top two teams that season, and whether the BCS did a good job of matching up who the top two teams were, or a not great job in a playoff. Listen, obviously a playoff would have done it better every single year. That's the only true way to find a national champion. I'm just simply posing a question here. Now in this video, I'm going to be specifically talking about the BCS National Championship game, not the actual BCS in general. So I won't be talking about all the times Kansas State was left out of BCS games, or that 2008 Orange Bowl fiasco between Missouri and Kansas, or when teams got in over teams that shouldn't have, or I'm just talking about the national championship in this video. Now, obviously, each case is going to be based on what I think, so you may have a totally different number than what I do by the end of this. I'm going to be keeping track by doing a BCS and a FBCS. I'll let you assume what the F stands for there. I'm going to be kind of keeping track as to what I think during the course of this video. So let me know after you watch the video. Kind of keep a tally as you're going through, and I'm sure I'm going to be leaving out loads of stuff. I'm trying not to make this an hour-long video because you certainly could about the BCS. This intro has actually gone on long enough. But let me know what your total is down below. The BCS ran for 15 years, so just let me know your win-loss, your BCS versus FBCS total. And without further ado, we're going to get started with the 1998 season. Kansas State and UCLA lost on the very last Saturday of the season, pitting Florida State as the top one-loss team that year against Ohio State, UCLA, and Kansas State. That season, Tennessee was undefeated. Therefore, they're pretty much a shoe-in when there's no other undefeated teams. And Florida State overcame a really weird early season loss to NC State to kind of bounce back and beat everyone else on their schedule the rest of the way, including beating number 4 Florida in the big rivalry game by 11 points in the season. Point BCS. In 1999, Florida State and Virginia Tech were the only teams that were undefeated at the FBS level other than Marshall. And I'm sorry, Thundering Herd, you just didn't do enough. You didn't have enough quality opponents. Point BCS. In 2000, Oklahoma was undefeated. Obviously, no point of contention there. They ended up facing Florida State, whose only loss on the season came against Ken Dorsey and the Miami Hurricanes when Dorsey threw a pass to Jeremy Shockey with 46 seconds left for the win. That same Hurricanes team had lost in Week 2 against the Washington Huskies, and Washington went on to give Oregon State their only loss, but then lost to Oregon in Washington's only loss. The Ducks, Beavers, and Huskies all shared the Pac-10 championship. Also, on November 4th, number 3 Miami beat number 2 Virginia Tech by 20 points to give the Hokies their only loss. So, to recap, Miami gave Virginia Tech and Florida State their only losses. Washington gave Miami and Oregon State their only losses. Yet, when the final BCS standings were released, they stayed the same for the third straight week. Oklahoma number 1, Florida State number 2, Miami number 3, Washington number 4. Something about that doesn't make sense. That's in part because the Hurricanes have been ranked ahead of Florida State for 5 straight AP polls. Point FBS. FBCS. Point FBCS. In 2001, Miami went undefeated. No problem there. Tennessee's loss in the SEC Championship opened up the door to a Nebraska team who, even after a bye week, got beat by number 14 Colorado 62-36. That was the Cornhuskers' only loss that season. Colorado finished 3rd, Tennessee finished 4th. Oregon, by the way, their only loss came to Stanford by a touchdown, and they ended up beating Colorado in the Fiesta Bowl. Not looking good, BCS. Point FBCS. In 2002, Miami and Ohio State both finished the season as the only undefeated FBS Power 5 teams, or was Power 6 back then? Power 6 back then. They were the only undefeated teams at that level. Absolutely no problem with this game. The outcome, however, 2003. What a mess. The Oklahoma Sooners were number 1 in the preseason poll and number 1 to finish the regular season. The problem was the 12th ranked Kansas State Wildcats didn't care and murdered Oklahoma 35-7 in the Big 12 championship game. The problem was Oklahoma was so far ahead in the polls and the BCS standings at the time that it didn't matter, and they still finished number 1. Okay? What the more interesting question would be is who would be number 2? Nick Saban's LSU team, their only loss of the season was a 19-7 loss against unranked Florida, while USC, their only loss of the season was a 34-31 triple overtime loss against Cal. The Trojans had been number 2 in the AP poll for 5 straight weeks and finished the regular season AP number 1 in the country. So, obviously, the BCS, it was Oklahoma versus USC for the... No, it wasn't. LSU got in, and LSU beat Oklahoma. USC beat number 4 Michigan in the Rose Bowl and ended up splitting the national championship, the last time that will probably ever happen, between the BCS championship going to LSU and the AP championship going to USC. Looking back, I know hindsight's 20/20 and everything, but it probably should have been LSU and USC. 35-7 right before you announced the game. That's pretty damning, but I'm going to say point FBCS. 2004, another 3-team cluster. 2004 once again saw USC, Oklahoma, and a team from the SEC West all finish with very similar records. In this case, they were all undefeated. Auburn had gone undefeated through a really tough SEC slate that year and was left out by the BCS, who chose Oklahoma and USC. And if you bring it up to an Auburn fan, they'll never even talk about it. You'll never even know that it existed. USC ended up blasting Oklahoma 55-19 in the Orange Bowl. And I remember I was, 15 when this was going on, 14? And I remember sitting there going, oh, Auburn is going to be so mad. It definitely should have been USC and Auburn that year, but what are you going to do? What I'm going to do is give a point to the FBCS. It's really hard, by the way, to not say FBS after that's been you have the FCS and the FBS, and now I'm trying to say FBCS. So bear with me if I say it weird. 2005, the biggest no-brainer in the history of sports. Undefeated Texas and undefeated USC played in what I still consider the greatest game I've ever seen in my life, point BCS. In 2006, what I considered a college football controversy, and something that I did actually hear people around the country talk about, was whether in the BCS National Championship game we should have a rematch between Ohio State and Michigan. Those teams faced off at the end of the year, as they always do. This time they were ranked number 1 and number 2. It was an incredibly good game, and Ohio State edged Michigan out at the very end of the game. Well, the BCS had different ideas and decided to go champion versus champion, bringing in 12-1 Florida, whose only loss was to an Auburn team that had been in the top 10 for most of that season. Of course, I was very wrong about this game. After Ohio State brought out the opening kickoff for a touchdown, Florida ran all over them and ended up beating Ohio State 41-14. I was wrong. Point BCS. 2007, my favorite year of college football of all time. I'll be making a video going more in depth on this later on in the summer. It'll come out right before the season starts. Is kind of when I'm planning on it, so I'm not going to go too much into this, but basically this could be titled as the season nobody wanted the national championship. Ohio State probably got caught looking ahead to the game against Michigan a little bit and got beat by Illinois. LSU had already lost twice that season against Kentucky and against Arkansas, both on the road, both in triple overtime. Those two ended up playing for the BCS championship that year with LSU winning. In the pure total chaos of the 2007 season where everybody was just melting down left and right, there was no good thing to do. That's how we got a 2-loss champion. So I'm going to just give the point to the BCS because, what were they going to do? 2008. 2008 was a weird season. Alabama, in their second season under Nick Saban, had gone the entire season undefeated. They were 12-0, but they lost against Tim Tebow and the Gators in the SEC championship game. The Gators, of course, lost that 1-point game against Ole Miss in the Tebow speech game, 31-30, I believe, and then Florida went undefeated after that. Utah went undefeated and eventually beat Alabama in the Sugar Bowl once Alabama didn't get selected for the national championship game. Oklahoma lost to Texas, who lost to Texas Tech, who lost to Oklahoma. And all three of those teams split the Big 12 South Championship that year, but Oklahoma got the nod to go into the Big 12 Championship game based on their BCS ranking. USC, meanwhile, lost early on to Oregon State, but pretty much spent the rest of the season flexing on every other team they played. At the end of the day, Utah's schedule didn't quite pan out, didn't put them among the rest of the other teams. Florida had beaten Alabama. Oklahoma had been given the nod to be in the Big 12 championship game, which they won. So you could argue Florida and Oklahoma were conference champions. They were both chosen among that field of teams. It's kind of tough, but I'm going to give the nod to the BCS here. In 2009, we actually had 5 teams go undefeated from the FBS, and those were Texas, Alabama, TCU, Cincinnati, and Boise State. Of course, it's Texas and it's Alabama, so they got in, which I'm not complaining about because essentially they were going up against 3 mid-major teams, and it's 2 of the biggest powerhouses in the history of college football. They haven't met in a long time. Yeah, I'm going to give a point to the BCS here. 2010, poor TCU. Once again, they go undefeated. Once again, they just didn't have enough oomph to get into the national championship game, especially when you had Oregon and Auburn, 2 Power 5 teams, conference champions. They were undefeated. They ended up playing for the national championship with Auburn winning. TCU, when you look at their schedule, they just didn't have enough. They just didn't play enough quality opponents. Their only ranked teams was an Oregon State team that finished with a losing record, and they beat number 6 Utah by 40 points, but it just wasn't enough. 2011. Well, here we are. Probably the biggest reason we actually have a college football playoff is probably this season right here. LSU finished the season 13-0, winning the SEC championship, winning the SEC West, and of course beating Alabama 9-6 in the game of the century in Tuscaloosa on a field goal in overtime. Alabama's only loss of the season. Oklahoma State famously went up to Iowa State to play a Thursday night game in front of a crazy crowd. They were also mourning the loss of some members of the university athletic staff who had died in a plane crash either that day or the day before. And Iowa State beat them in double overtime. To be honest, it's tough. You can call me biased if you want. This was my senior year at the University of Alabama. I obviously wanted UA in the game. I also felt like LSU and Alabama were clearly the best 2 teams in the country. You could always argue that Oklahoma State didn't have a chance to show that, but don't lose to a not good Iowa State team. So I think the BCS got it right. Go ahead and knock it up. I got a point for the BCS here. And then Alabama played LSU in the rematch, obviously, and Alabama won 21-0. To me, proving me right. I thought Alabama was the best team in the country, and they missed like 5 field goals in that game. Literally any of them would have changed the entire thing of that game, and it probably would have been Alabama-Oklahoma State in the national championship. I don't know, maybe it would have been an Alabama-LSU rematch anyway, but I think the BCS got it right. Go ahead, yell at me. In 2012, Notre Dame was undefeated. Okay, great. I have no problem there, though I don't think their schedule was the toughest in the world, but hey, whatever. They're undefeated. They're Notre Dame. They're going to be there. They ended up playing Alabama, whose only loss on the year was in November against Johnny Manziel in his Heisman game, right? Probably his most memorable college game of all time is where his Heisman moment happened in Tuscaloosa. A&M's first, SEC match against Alabama. They won. That was Alabama's only loss on the year, and they beat number 3 Georgia in the SEC championship game in a de facto national championship semifinal. So I think the BCS got it right here as well. 2013, the final season of the BCS, the college football playoff had been announced, and there was much rejoicing in the kingdom. Florida State and Alabama seemed like they were on a collision course all year long. Alabama was undefeated, Florida State was undefeated, and then Alabama wasn't. Obviously, the Auburn's magical season kicked in there towards the end of the year. They had that Hail Mary tip pass against Georgia. then the obvious kick 6 game against Alabama, knocking Alabama out of the SEC championship game. Auburn went on to beat Missouri in the SEC championship game. Florida State won the ACC and was still undefeated. And Ohio State, who looked like they would slip into the number 2 spot and play Florida State, lost to Michigan State in the Big Ten championship game. It was a classic game that went down to the wire. Florida State pulled it out with 13 seconds left in the final BCS national championship game. And honestly, at the end of the day, I think they got that one right as well. So, one more point, BCS. So there you have it. I think mostly the BCS got it right. Now, obviously, it goes without saying, there's no way to prove that. Who's to say that a number 8 Oregon State team wouldn't have ended up the national champions at one point, or a couple of those TCU teams? I understand that, but based on perception, based on what we thought about the teams going into that, after that last game, whether it be the championship or the last regular season game if they didn't have a conference championship, I think most of the time they got it right. Now, when you're only limited down to 2 teams, there's really no way to ever know. But if I could have only picked 2 teams, most of these years, as you can see, I would have picked what the BCS picked. Yes, maybe Boise State wins the 2006 national championship. Maybe they do. Maybe that win against Oklahoma wasn't a fluke. Maybe Utah in 2009. Maybe 2008. Maybe Alabama in 2008. Maybe, I don't know. It's really tough to know. Especially early on, I think there was a lot of room for some of those teams to have made some noise at 4 or 8 if there was a playoff. I had a request recently in one of my videos to do to look back at what the playoff would have looked like during the BCS if we had a 4 or an 8-team playoff. If you would be interested in seeing a video like that, let me know down below. Let me know what your BCS versus FBCS rankings were, what the record was against each other. What do you think about some of these teams? We're all glad the BCS is gone. I'm not trying to petition to bring the BCS back, but I don't think it was, at least the championship game part of it, was quite as bad as we all sometimes remember it to be. That's all I was trying to figure out in this video, and as I went through and looked at the history of it and kind of looked at the teams and where they were, most of the years, as you can see from the score, it makes sense to me. So definitely want to hear your thoughts, see what you guys think about it. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. You can click on the circle with the trophy right there in order to subscribe, or catch any of the videos over there on the right-hand side of the screen that YouTube has chosen for you. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, until next time. Job in a playoff. Listen, obviously a playoff would have done it better every single year. That's the only true way to find a national champion. I'm just simply posing a question here. Now in this video, I'm going to be specifically talking about the BCS National Championship game, not the actual BCS in general. So I won't be talking about all the times Kansas State was left out of BCS games, or that 2008 Orange Bowl fiasco between Missouri and Kansas, or when teams got in over teams that shouldn't have, or I'm just talking about the national championship. Hey lifers, Dustin here, and today I want to take a look at a pretty controversial question, and that question is, was the BCS really that bad? Did they really get it wrong more often than they got it right? That's something I want to take a look at by breaking down pretty much each season real quick. Not a big long thing, but each season pretty quickly, and figure out who I consider to be the top 2 teams that season, and whether the BCS did a good job of matching up who the top 2 teams were, or a not great job in this video. Now, obviously, each case is going to be based on what I think, so you may have a totally different number than what I do by the end of this. I'm going to be keeping track by doing a BCS and a FBCS. I'll let you assume what the F stands for there. I'm going to be kind of keeping track as to what I think during the course of this video. So let me know after you watch the video. Kind of keep a tally as you're going through, and I'm sure I'm going to be leaving out loads of stuff. I'm trying not to make this an hour-long video because you certainly could about the BCS. This intro has actually gone on long enough. But let me know what your total is down below. The BCS ran for 15 years, so just let me know your win-loss, your BCS versus FBCS total. And without further ado, we're going to get started with the 1998 season. Kansas State and UCLA lost on the very last Saturday of the season, pitting Florida State as the top one-loss team that year against Ohio State, UCLA, and Kansas State. That season, Tennessee was undefeated. Therefore, they're pretty much a shoe-in when there's no other undefeated teams. And Florida State overcame a really weird early season loss to NC State to kind of bounce back and beat everyone else on their schedule the rest of the way, including beating number 4 Florida in the big rivalry game by 11 points in the season. Point BCS. In 1999, Florida State and Virginia Tech were the only teams that were undefeated at the FBS level other than Marshall. And I'm sorry, Thundering Herd, you just didn't do enough. You didn't have enough quality opponents. Point BCS. In 2000, Oklahoma was undefeated.